and we welcome you again to the Working Class Movement Library's Invisible Histories talks, as we welcome a double bill on a Labour women theme with Natasha Periyan speaking on Vera Brittain and meritocracy, followed by Clara Jones on the topic Ellen Wilkinson and Virginia Woolf write to the House of Commons. And as I always say, the library's events are free. However, we would, as ever, like to encourage you to support the library if you're able to do so. There's a donate button on our website. And thank you very much indeed. It is much appreciated, those of you who have been doing that. Okay, without further ado, over to you, Natasha.
Thanks, Lynette. Okay, I'm just going to share my screen, so bear with me 1 minute. Okay, is that all right? Can everyone see that? If I move that toolbar. Yeah. Okay. So thanks everyone for coming. So today I'm going to talk about Vera Brittain and meritocracy. So on the 8th of May 1934, the writer Vera Brittain wrote a candid letter to her friend Winifred Holtby. She wrote, "I'm afraid I'm not really a good Democrat, for there still doesn't seem to me anything quite equal to complete intelligence plus complete well-bredness. If one has to choose, one of course prefers the intelligence without the breeding, but there's something in thoroughbredness which makes for the self-confidence and dependability that you never quite get without it. What snobbish reflections." Vera Brittain was a lifelong Labour supporter after joining the party in 1925. She was a dutiful campaigner for Labour in 1931 when her husband, George Catlin, ran for Labour MP for Brentford and Chiswick, and then when he ran again in 1937, and at that point he was running for a seat in Sunderland. Even so, in this letter, Brittain has to chastise herself for her snobbish reflections, as she examines her own complicated feelings around questions of mental ability, hereditary privilege, and democratic values. So, as Brittain says, if presented with a choice, she would prefer intelligence over breeding. And this seems to reflect a peculiarly early 20th century preoccupation with the concept of intelligence, which, as Kurt Danziger, sorry, I'm just trying to change there, sorry, which, as Kurt Danziger identifies, was a scientific buzzword in the early years of the 20th century. The concept of intelligence was absorbed into psychology from 19th century evolutionary biology, which perceived cognition as essentially layered or graded. And it graded man's intelligence on a scale with animal. And crucially, with the work of Charles Darwin and Francis Galton, women's intelligence was also held as inferior to men's. So in The Descent of Man, Darwin cites Galton in his finding that women's inferior mental ability was incontrovertible. He argued that men demonstrate higher eminence in whatever they take up than women. And Darwin goes on to argue that the average of mental power in man must be above that of woman. So, as you'll be aware, the academic discipline of psychology developed the intelligence test in the early 20th century. This psychological tool became the engine of a meritocratic social order via the scholarship ladder. In the interwar period, the intelligence test informed the debate around secondary educational reform. So the 1924 Haddo report examined intelligence tests as a possible tool for educational organisation, in what, as the 1926 Haddo report came to identify, was envisaged as a tripartite educational system. And this was kind of structured around the idea of a grammar school, a technical school, and a secondary modern school. Adrian Wooldridge identifies that in the interwar period, meritocratic mobility offered a means of reconciling elitism with democracy. As psychologists claimed that the intelligence test was an objective measure of mental ability, a position that was of course later critiqued by educationists and sociologists of the 1950s and the 1960s. The vulnerability of the line between democracy and elitism that meritocracy symbolises is evident in this letter, as Britain's democratic sensibilities seemed to fail her. Her biological assessment of mental ability and heredity, as she finds that the optimum combination is intelligence plus well-bredness, leaves Britain reproaching herself for being not really a good democrat. Now, the question of female intelligence in particular was particularly close to Britain's heart. Britain had met the recipient of her letter, her close friend Winifred Holtby, while they were both undergraduates at Somerville College, Oxford. Brittain and Holtby were among the first women to be awarded degrees from Oxford after the university first granted them to women in 1920. And Brittain describes this event as the victorious result of a battle of half a century long against academic masculine prejudice. In 1920 to 1921, around the time that Holtby and Brittain graduated from Oxford, just 542 of the 3,663 students at Oxford were women. As active feminist campaigners, female intelligence was a live political issue for Britain, and her literary texts are informed by interwar debates surrounding gender, intelligence, and education. So, in my analysis of Vera Brittain's relationship to the meritocratic ideal today, I consider the fine line intelligence occupied between the forces of social progress, such as educational reform and feminist politics, and social reaction, including eugenicist discourses, and the association of mental ability with moral qualities. For Britain, the wastage of female intelligence was a profoundly urgent feminist question. Her article, The Whole Duty of Woman, published on the 23rd of February 1923 in the feminist periodical Time and Tide, responded to the 1923 Haddo report on the differentiation of the curriculum for boys and girls in secondary schools. So it's quite a long report, but it really had two key findings. So the first was that on the whole, female mental ability was found to be equal to male, and it was social factors, not intelligence, that constrained women's mental ability. And it also found that the difference in mental ability between the same sex is more noteworthy than the difference of mental ability between the two sexes. So the report suggested that this difference was so enormous as almost to obliterate the smaller group differences. I'm interested in these findings because I think they accommodate a political commitment to equality between the sexes, while also facilitating a conception of intellectual inequality within the same sex in ways that kind of refract aspects of Vera Brittain's politics. So, Brittain's article follows the report's observations that home life obstructs the development of girls' intellect. The article is concerned with the discrepancy between the family demands made on male and female siblings as they attempt to pursue their education. Brittain depicts female intelligence within the, quote, average middle-class family as seldom the source of anything but domestic controversy. So she writes, if she loses in the struggle for education, she is obliged, for reasons very different from those of the unprofitable servant in the parable, to bury her talent in the earth. If she wins, she emerges from the contest with so much the less vitality for the arena of open competition. The better the woman, the more desperate the struggle, until she may well be driven to doubt whether her duty be the stern daughter of the voice of God or the arbitrary creation of her grandmother. Her liberty, if ever it is finally achieved, leaves her with only half her vitality left for her profession. The other half has been exhausted by the battle between her insistent reason and her well-trained conscience. Can we wonder that the prejudiced and the ignorant, who judge by surface values only, still have grounds for regarding the woman as inherently less capable than the man of holding her own in the race of life? In the home, at school, in the university, in the professions, it was only after a prolonged struggle that she reaches the place where he was able to begin. So Brittain here brings the parable of the talents into conversation with Darwinian ideas as she offers a feminist critique of the societal forces that are barriers to female intelligence. While the servant in the parable buries his single talent due to fear and lack of ability, intelligent girls are forced to bury their abilities due to family pressure. The Darwinian discourse in the language of struggle and battle and phrases such as the race of life is striking in the context of Darwin's own position on female ability. For Brittain, however, the prejudiced and the ignorant only are convinced of men's superior intellect. So Brittain uses social Darwinist ideas to suggest that for women, the struggle must first come with the family and the self, and second with other examinees. The effects of the former struggle compromise the ability to succeed in the latter. She writes, and then we are told that the results of competitive examinations prove women to be less capable than men of achieving first-class honours. So I'm interested here in the slippage between the terms contest, used to signal the Darwinian struggle between family and self for the intelligent girl, in my previous quotation, and competition, which is used in the context of the competitive scholarship exam. And I think this signals how the language of meritocracy is also the language of social Darwinism. In this article, Brittain's gendered critique, inspired by the findings of the 1923 Hedder report, implies that women are at a disadvantage within the meritocratic order. So I want to turn now to talk about Brittain's autobiography, Testament of Youth. So obviously this text is a very moving elegy for Britain's lost generation, but I also want to think about it in the context of meritocracy and the competitive exam, and think more specifically about the earlier sections of the text. So these early sections of the text reflect the gender-based familial struggle with learning that Brittain also identifies in her article, The Whole Duty of Woman. These sections of the text record Brittain's struggle to escape from what she calls provincial young ladyhood. She describes her journey to Oxford from Buxton via St. Monica's, which is a genteel girls' private school, and through the Oxford Extension lectures in Buxton. As a result of her success in an essay competition, Brittain attended the Oxford Summer Meeting, and during this visit, she resolved to apply to Somerville, the Women's College at Oxford. Her parents resisted, however, this struggle to go to Oxford. So this is a photo of Brittain, her brother, and both her parents. So Brittain suggests that while her brother had a, quote, privileged position as a boy, despite his, quote, limited qualities of scholarship, the idea of refusing Edward a university education never so much as crossed my father's mind. By contrast, Brittain records that each fresh refusal to spend another penny on my education plunged me into further depths of gloom. While her brother was not academic, Brittain records her reputation for, quote, brains. Impressed by her intellect, Brittain's brother declares her to have, quote, more brains than most girls, who he suggests are, quote, idiots, and he encourages her to compete for the Somerville Scholarship, which Brittain presents as the utmost test of mental rigour. So she writes, owing to its higher examination standards, Somerville was by far the most difficult of the women's colleges to enter. Brittain acknowledges the all-consuming part competitive exams played in her youth, suggesting that her readers will probably feel that I have given far too much time and space to the adolescent subject of examinations. Part of the purpose of this early section of the text is to create a contrast between the young Brittain's focus on her own academic attainments and her immersion in a concern for her lover, Roland, and his well-being on the front after meeting him. This contrast is deliberately pursued. After the principal of Somerville congratulates her on a, quote, brilliant performance in one of her Greek exams, she comes to the realization that examinations still existed and some people still thought they mattered. The text is really interested in the question of intelligence, as Brittain repeatedly measures and quantifies the minds of others. The educationist Ansgar Allen suggests that examination has come to shape an entire set of perceptions. It conditions how we relate to ourselves, how we relate to one another, and how we relate to our present. Testament of Youth depicts a consciousness formed in relation to this meritocratic ideal and the competitive examination. The text emphasises the difficulty of the competition for the Somerville Scholarship. And on coming to Oxford to sit the exam, Brittain is struck by the imperturbable brilliance of my fellow competitors, roughly 100 for about 20 vacancies. This sense of the intellectual brilliance of her Oxford competitors forms a stark contrast to Brittain's perception of the intelligence of her peers at her school, St. Monica's, where she notes the mildness of the intellectual competition. In a climate where marriage was the major preoccupation of an intelligent girl, most of her fellow pupils regarded university as a quite unnecessary prolongation of useless and distasteful studies. She describes her school friend Betty as possessing intellectual possibilities which she was never sufficiently interested to explore. Childhood visitors to her home in Macclesfield and Buxton are characterised as mentally restricted local residents with their even more limited wives. A potential beau in Buxton had what she calls limited brains, a pointed contrast to Roland, whom she meets at a school prize-giving ceremony, where he dominates the list of awards. By contrast to the intellectual inertia Brittain sees in Buxton, she characterises university towns and capital cities as populated by groups of ambitious, intelligent boys and girls, and at Oxford, discussions of genius form part of Somerville's social life. Brittain's assessment of provincial life sees her align merit with intelligence. She writes, "To me, provincialism stood and stands for the sum total of all false values. It is the estimation of people for what they have or pretend to have, and not for what they are. Artificial classifications, rigid lines of demarcation that bear no relation whatsoever to intrinsic merit, seem to belong to its very essence, while contempt for intelligence, suspicion and fear of independent thought appear to be necessary passports to provincial popularity." So Brittain here associates intrinsic merit with intelligence and independent thought, while suggesting that the provinces are beholden to false values, which are founded in material possessions. Brittain repeated this critique in very similar terms in an article titled "Provincialism, Why I Dislike It" in the Manchester Evening News. So that's on, a photograph of that article is on the slide. In the article, Brittain claims the contemporary relevance of her girlhood experiences. So she writes, "The testimony of trustworthy friends reluctantly immersed in small town life still provide evidence of those same artificial classifications, those rigid lines of demarcation, bearing no relation whatsoever to intrinsic merit, which oppressed my girlhood." In both her Manchester Evening News article and in Testament of Youth, Brittain's reference to artificial classifications and rigid lines of demarcation in reference to material possessions seems to evoke the language of intelligence, which Brittain holds to be a more worthwhile means of categorising and classifying. Adrian Wooldridge delineates the ways in which intelligence and in turn merit was associated with social virtues such as personal initiative and mobility. And for Brittain, a perceived absence of intelligence in her childhood town becomes aligned with social ills, materialism and narrow-mindedness. Now, not surprisingly, Brittain's article attracted controversy, and the Yorkshire-based novelist Phyllis Bentley wrote a vociferous riposte to her article, also in the Manchester Evening News, where she wrote, "I regret this tendency to deplete the provinces of their talent." And she noted also that London had its own provincial qualities. In Testament of Youth, Brittain navigates the nature versus nurture debate on the origins of intelligence. She writes, and I'm sorry, the bottom of the quotation is cut off, but I'll read it out. I believe that it is Albert Edward Wigham, the American author of The Fruit of the Family Tree, who has calculated that half of the world's distinguished men and women are produced by 1% of its population, and that all the teeming mediocre millions of the rest of mankind are required to contribute the other half of its leaders. But when I consider, and in my later teens I often used to consider, the incalculable advantages of heredity and early environment, what really seems remarkable is not the undistinguished residue produces only half the sum of human talent, but that those who belong to it ever emerge at all from the blackest obscurity. In its review of Testament of Youth, the New English Weekly suggested that Brittain had a temperament inclined to singularity. And in this quotation, this temperament is manifested through her adherence to a meritocratic social order, in which Brittain positions herself as exceptional. And of course, in many ways, she was. At the beginning of the 20th century, women made up just 15% of the student body, with this number rising marginally to 23% by 1939. Albert Edward Wiggins, the author Brittain quotes, was, the historian Daniel Kevler's notes, one of the leading popularizers of the creed of eugenics. Carrying adverts for the American Eugenics Society, his text, The Fruit of the Family Tree, is a declamatory defense of heredity as the source of genius. Wigham derides egalitarian schemes for social progress, citing a scientific study which he argues debunks what he calls the fallacy of equal opportunity. Arguing that science has found that brains are largely a family affair, he advocates eugenicist measures. In all of the remarkable methods for measuring brains recently invented, such as the intelligence test, Wigham notes, do you know that about 1% of the world's population has produced 1/2 of the world's great leaders, while it has taken all the countless millions of people of ordinary blood to produce the other half? A statistic that Brittain intensifies through her alliterative, teeming, mediocre millions of mankind, which serves to intensify a sense of the mass from which she has emerged. Intelligence testing had an all-encompassing pure view in interwar America, as John Carson notes. It offered a means of categorizing minds across the educational, industrial, and public sector. And in the 1920s, America grappled with the question of differences in intelligence and the implications of this for democracy. Wigham reflects this social context in The Fruit of the Family Tree, which presents a biopolitical vision of governance that frames political systems through biological categories. He argues that no nation is truly free that does not build its institutions on the basis of biology and heredity. He finds that while an autocracy keeps too much worthless blood in high places, by contrast, a democracy is likely to carry the doctrine of equality of men too far and not give proper scope and recognition to the abler stocks. Wigham instead proposes an aristo-republicanism such as our fathers intended this country to have, a system that recognizes all elements that fosters the differences among men, their differences of blood and brains, a society that recognizes and rewards social and intellectual worth. I believe that the laws of blood, heredity, assortative mating of the good with the good will carry us always toward a great national goal. So Wigham alludes to Thomas Jefferson's aristocracy of brains as a founding principle of American democracy, with the new science of intelligence testing offering a tool through which to apply this ideal to social structures. It is this commitment to an aristo-republicanism of social and intellectual worth that underpins Brittain's recognition in her 1934 letter to Holtby that she is not really a good Democrat. The tension between her elitist instincts and a democratic social ideal is one that gets played out in Testament of Youth's discussion of scholarship in class, as Brittain records her youthful response to her competitors for the Somerville Scholarship. While acknowledging that she now recognises that the accents and the ill-fitting shabby clothes of her competition does not negate the fact that the girls were from genuinely cultured homes, at the time she writes that it required a combination of ambition and all my touching belief that I was a natural democrat filled with an overwhelming love of humanity to persuade me that I had never really felt the snobbish revulsion against rough and readiness which my specialised upbringing had made inevitable. As Brittain acknowledges here, perceptions of meritocratic worth is inflected by profoundly British class consciousness. So to conclude, in Testament of Youth, Brittain's social vision is informed by an American eugenicist text that demonstrates how seamlessly interwar meritocratic discourse shaded into the eugenicist. While in her earlier journalism, Brittain's language around female intellectual achievement alert us to the social Darwinist strains that inflected the concept of meritocracy in the interwar period. The fact that Brittain's stumblings around her democratic ideals cohere around the question of intelligence demonstrates how, in developing her feminist politics that found women's mental ability to be equal to men's, Brittain simultaneously reflected discourses that fell into prizing intelligence as a moral good and a measure of social worth. Thank you. I'm gonna stop sharing.
Hi. Thanks so much, Natasha. That was brilliant.
Thanks, Clara. I'm looking forward to the talk. Yeah, I'm looking forward to.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay, fabulous. Thanks. I'm going to share my screen. Here we go. Okay, does that look all right? Okay, lovely. All right, thank you so much, Natasha, for your paper, and also thank you so much, Lynette, for inviting us today. It's really brilliant. I'm just going to make it so that I can see myself, so I know what I'm doing. Lovely. Okay, all right. So my talk today focuses on writing about the House of Commons, published in 1932 by Virginia Woolf and Ellen Wilkinson. And I think both of these pieces of writing have a lot to tell us about this tumultuous moment in parliamentary politics. So these pieces of writing, their proximity to the 1928 Equal Representation Act, and the fact that both of them are written by women, I mean, would seem to invite us to focus on the lens of gender when we read them. And that's certainly going to come into it. But what I want to put the focus on, or the spotlight on today, is party politics, which is at once the most obvious context for reading this writing, particularly Ellen Wilkinson's, as she was a Labour MP, but it's also a context that hasn't received as much attention. Woolf and Wilkinson both identified as Labour women. So here is Woolf. Here's Woolf describing herself as a Labour woman. And just the context for this is that she's describing a conversation that she had with someone called Lord Gage of Firle, who was the local squire of where Charleston farmhouse is. So she says, "We talked about the king and he snubbed me by saying that he remarked an odd fact. Everyone talks to him about the king. Every class, every kind of person is interested to know what the king has for dinner. And here was I, the intellectual, the Labour woman, doing just the same thing." And what I like about this quotation is I think it's funny, it's humorous, but she's also using her Labour credentials as a way of positioning herself in opposition to an aristocratic kind of class and her assumptions about the politics that go along with that. So although the idea of being a Labour woman meant very different things to Woolf and to Wilkinson, but it's not necessarily to say that it meant something straightforward to Wilkinson where it meant something more complicated to Woolf. Their party political loyalties certainly bore on their impressions of the House of Commons, and that's what I'm going to talk about now. So Virginia Woolf's article, "This is the House of Commons," was the 5th of 6 articles she published in Good Housekeeping magazine between December 1931 and 1932. So collectively, these articles offer a tour of sites and monuments of London with an interesting focus on sites of commerce and of labour. So one of the articles focuses on Oxford Street, another focuses on the docks of London. Woolf took a dismissive attitude towards these pieces. She writes in her diary, "I'm being bored to death by my London articles, 6 of them, and not a thought for fear of clouding the brilliancy." And this dismissive attitude led early critics of these articles to suggest that she'd perhaps compromised her political vision in order to meet the editorial expectations or demands of a popular women's magazine. I've got this image here that I just want to show you. This is the image that went alongside Woolf's article, This is the House of Commons, when it was first published. It's quite eerie and strange with these kind of figures of great men looming over these kind of little Lowry-like figures at the bottom of the entering the house, and maybe I'll come back to that later. So the scholar Alice Wood, who's done really interesting work on these London articles, suggests that, sorry, that's my doorbell going. That's quite typical. So Alice Wood has suggested that these readings that suggest Woolf compromised her political vision are based on a misunderstanding of Woolf's, of the periodical culture of Good Housekeeping magazine, which in fact did a really good line in social commentary. So, yeah, even as recent critics have given a stronger picture of the political critiques and commitments of these articles, there's been less of a focus on This is the House of Commons. And I think that the reason for that is that this article, as we'll see, is a bit more difficult to fold into a broadly kind of affirmative reading of Woolf, or a kind of politically palatable reading of Woolf. And I'm guilty of wanting to do that as well, wanting to read Woolf as a Labour woman, as a committed Labour woman. And at the outset, it's a bit difficult to do that when we're reading this article, which I'm going to come on to now. So I think part of this is to do with the oddness of Woolf's handling of point of view and narrative voice in this article. It's very hard to situate the speaking voice of this article, who they think they're speaking for when they say we. So people have suggested that Woolf's use of we is a way of aligning herself with the Good Housekeeping's readership. But I think that a diary entry written in 1929, a troubling diary entry, offers a different way of reading this we. So this diary was written during the 1929 flapper election, so the first one in which all women over 21 could vote. And during this, and it was during this election that Woolf was supporting her husband's campaign for a Labour seat. But as we'll see, Woolf's her private reflections did not match her public commitment. So here she is, and I'm competing here with Natasha on snobbish reflections. So she writes in her diary, "We are winning," Nellie said at tea. "I was shocked to think that we both desire the Labour Party to win. Why? Partly that I don't want to be ruled by Nellie. I think to be ruled by Nellie and Lottie would be a disaster." So I'm sure you can see why this is a difficult passage again for scholars wishing to take a kind of affirmative view of Woolf's politics. You know, Woolf's shock at finding herself voting in the same way as her servants Nellie Boxall and Lottie Hope has been read as evidence of the limits of her political imagination, which is, I think it's understandable, is quite shocking, makes for quite shocking reading. But also taking a step back, this kind of line is consistent with the vanguardist Fabian politics espoused by Virginia Woolf and her husband Leonard Woolf. So in some way, it's actually kind of consistent with a line of thinking in Labour politics. I'm sure there are lots of people in the audience today who know more about this than me. So what I want to suggest in my reading of the article is that there's more going on in Woolf's politics there than apparently meets the eye, and that Woolf's thinking about parliamentary politics in particular is more subtly inflected than the language, the totalizing language of being ruled that we see in this passage here. So take the account of the customs surrounding the speaker's entrance into the central lobby. And here it is, I'll read it out for you. A raucous voice bawling, "The speaker," heralds the tramp of a plain democratic procession whose only pomp is provided by the mace and the speaker's wig and gown and gold badges of the head waiters. The raucous voice bawls again, "Hats off, strangers," upon which a number of dingy felt hats are flourished obediently and the head waiters bow from the middle downwards. That is all. And yet the bawling voice, the black gown, the tramp of feet on the stone, the mace and the dingy hats somehow suggest, better than scarlet and trumpets, that the commons are taking their seats in their own house to proceed with the business of their own country. So Woolf seems to be taking a sentimental view of the commons here, but this passage looks different when we consider the moment in commons history she's recording. It was under the control of a minority Labour government, only the second ever to control the House. Woolf appears to me to be on the lookout for ways in which Labour is making itself felt in Westminster. The repeated references to dingy felt hats register an awareness of how Labour altered the class composition of the House. Her use of commons to refer to MPs in general also operates more specifically to indicate common people, the common people Labour sought to represent and who populated their benches. I'm not suggesting that when Woolf speaks for we common people, she's speaking straightforwardly for Labour. What I suggest instead is that the collective that Woolf invokes in This is the House of Commons revisits the we of Nellie Boxall's We're Winning in 1929, continuing to probe her uneasy sense of herself as Labour and what it meant for Labour to be in power. Her treatment of the then Foreign Secretary Arthur Henderson is also revealing of this agenda. Dull but admirable, he couldn't be more different from his aristocratic forerunners. Here he is. Time was when the Foreign Secretary manipulated facts, toyed with them, elaborated them, and used all the resources of art and eloquence to make them appear what he chose they should appear to the people who had to accept his will. He was no common hard-worked man of business with a small car and villa and a great longing to get an afternoon off and play golf with his sons and daughters on a Surrey common. Woolf again is straining against the strictly parliamentary use of common. It appears as a classed term, as in common man, and as a publicly owned space, right? So the Surrey Common. This insistence on the different meanings of common hints at the differences between MPs. Not all commons are alike. Henderson's party politics are registered in his distinctly lower middle class suburban villa and small car. And these are figures that appear elsewhere in Woolf's writing of the period as markers of kind of mediocrity. But even as Woolf appears to criticise the Labour Party as the party of equality and of standardisation, her insistence on their efficiency and their seriousness of purpose serves a contradictory function. So I'm sure, as lots of you already know, so at this moment, Labour was not only new to government, but it was a new parliamentary estate. And as Chris Wrigley notes, Labour's relative youth as a party was something that its opponents seized on. And throughout the interwar period, Labour's constitutional credentials, right, its fitness to govern, were under constant attack. Labour responded in turn by asserting its parliamentarism, in part by attacking the credentials of the opposition, right, like what Woolf is doing here by saying that previously kind of Tory foreign secretaries were serpent-tongued. So Woolf is weighing into these debates about Labour's credentials in her essay. The contrast between Henderson's plain speaking and impersonal style of politics with this serpent-tongued foreign secretary casts Labour as reliable custodians of the Commons, in contrast to self-serving older parties. And I can't help but noting how resonant I feel this is today, where what we really want is kind of plain speaking rather than bluster and rhetoric. The similarities between Woolf's account of the 1929 Labour Party conference which she attended and her description of the House in her later article gives some traction, I think, to my argument here. So she reflects there how politics was no longer an affair of great nobles and mystery and diplomacy, but of common sense issuing from ordinary men and women of business, not very exalted, but straightforward. It's difficult not to read the narrator's insistence that, quote, the days of single men and personal power are over, as speaking specifically to the changing party political makeup of the House of Commons. Labour might come off as dull and conscientious in Woolf's article, but at a moment when their discipline and very legitimacy as an estate was in question, these were qualities the party very much wanted to claim for itself. And I think that that's what Woolf is doing here. She's contributing towards these claims, this staking out of territory that the Labour Party was conducting. Okay, I'm going to move on to Ellen Wilkinson now and her second novel, which I hope that some of you have read. I'm longing to talk to someone about it. It came out recently in the British Library classic crime kind of selection. So Wilkinson's The Division Bell mystery, I think, is also influenced by these contemporary broadsides against Labour's credentials. So as lots of you know, before becoming an MP in 1924, Ellen Wilkinson worked as a suffrage and union organiser. And these are experiences that informed her first novel, her first and better known novel, Clash, a general strike romance that was published in 1929. Reviewers of The Division Bell mystery suggested that it compared favourably with her first novel, which one reviewer said, quote, she rather spoiled by her overemphasis on the political side. The Division Bell mystery follows the conventions of a locked door mystery. Oh, where am I up to? Telling the story of an American financier shot dead in the private dining room in a private dining room in the House of Commons during a secret meeting with a renegade Tory Home Secretary who's trying to secure a massive government loan. Private Parliamentary Secretary Robert West turns sleuth to track down the murderer. The novel is steeped in its political moment, the central significance of American money and the backdrop of unemployment and bread marches, as well as a conservative premier who bears a striking resemblance to Ramsay MacDonald. All these things make it difficult to understand how this reviewer could have read the novel as avoiding the political side of Westminster. But perhaps this reviewer took Wilkinson's decision to make her protagonist a Tory rather than Labour MP as evidence of party political restraint. But this apparently ameliorative gesture, I think, is revealing of a subtler strategy on Wilkinson's part. So Robert West is a popular young bachelor who likes a glass of champagne and whose head is turned by a pretty face. But he's also a Tory facing an ideological crisis. And the Division Bell mystery is as interested in charting West's disenchantment with his party as it is with tracking down a killer. Wilkinson suggests that West's political affiliation is an accident of birth. His ease with the House of Commons is associated with the training he received in a public school. He's very pleased with himself and the figure that he cuts in the House, so much so that he, quote, found life too interesting at any particular moment to acquire sufficient of that knowledge to be awkward to his party whips. So he's no party ideologue, right? But someone for whom politics are a matter of habit and tradition. And Wilkinson takes great pleasure in staging his growing awareness of the inadequacy of his party's approach. And this is particularly clear in an impatient discussion that he has with someone called Colonel Stuart Orford, who represents the ancien regime of his party. So here it is. Imagine what Palmerston or Disraeli would have said at the idea of Britain going cap in hand to such a creature for money. The British government, damn it, Robert. Was this what we fought the war? Is this why we fought the war? Robert replies, I was at school when you were fighting that war, Colonel, and I supposed that you knew what you were doing, but it's left a pretty mess to be cleared up. And the England at his left is not the England of Palmerston and Victoria. We've got to deal with the facts, and American dollars are about the biggest of those facts. Let the socialists talk like that, said Stuart Orford. Like Woolf, Wilkinson is interested in parliamentary nostalgia, and they reach for the same historical figures, Palmerston and Disraeli, to explore this. But for all his modernising talk, West is repeatedly shown not to have the answers to the new challenges that the country faces. Only a few chapters later, he rages quite angrily against that public school education, which had given him no clue to this new world. West's response to a bread march he observes from a taxi window clarifies the political implications of Wilkinson's protagonist. The price of bread, the costliness of Annette. But a bread march was not like England. Robert suddenly realised that he had never seen a bread march in his life before. He had read of the demonstrations of the 80s and 90s, the long parades of unemployed in 1911, but the unemployment benefit had settled all that. Now it had been cut to the bone, and so this encounter derives some of its drama from the fact that it takes place after Robert has met the young heiress, granddaughter of the dead financier, in her luxurious flat, which is hung with Gauguin paintings. Robert is tantalizingly close to making the connection between the price of bread and the costliness of Annette, and articulating just the kind of socialist talk that the Colonel has accused him of. The halting quality of the writing at the beginning of the second paragraph, though, draws attention to West's failure to make these connections, even as the narrator foregrounds these connections for the reader. West's lack of first-hand experience, the fact he's only ever read about bread marches, and the naivety of his generalized thinking about unemployment benefit, shows that even apparently progressive Tories are incapable of addressing the problems faced by modern Britain. By contrast, Wilkinson's Labour MPs in the book model various forms of exemplary parliamentary behaviour that promote envy and longing in West. So there's the practical Gracie Richards, willing to take bipartisan measures for the good of the House and the country. And then there's the maverick backbencher, Michael Holdsworth, who knows, quote, every move in the parliamentary game. Right, I'm finishing now. When Wilkinson and Woolf wrote about the House of Commons in 1932, they did so at a moment of turbulence and strain for the Labour Party, and this marks the work that they produced. In this talk, I tried to give a very small sample of the kind of work my wider project on the politics of interwar women writers and activists tries to do. By taking socio-political debates as a point of entry, I want to show how the shared concerns and aesthetic reflexes to be found in work by writers whose literary profiles might look very different on paper. Okay, I'm finished. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed. If you're on gallery view, speakers, you will see that you have lots of virtual applause there, and
thank you very much.
You have yes, many quietly clapping hands. So, and as one of the teeming mediocre millions in our dingy felt hats, I'd like to say thank you very much indeed. So, folks, I hope you have some questions or some comments, and I have to say that we haven't got the Division Bell mystery in the library collection, which is a bit terrible, isn't it? So I feel a book club coming on, don't you? It seems like it's come out in a modern edition.
It's good. It's very Christmassy reading, I think. It's a good sort of thriller for everyone. I recommend it heartily.
Right. Well, while you're thinking, folks, I have got one question which has come through on the chat. So Steve would like to ask Natasha whether Vera Brittain modified her rather elitist views later in life. He says, I've been studying Brittain's thoughts and actions in World War II and have not come across these kinds of attitudes at that time in her life.
Thank you for the question. So to be honest, I focus on Britain in the interwar period. So I've not looked at her relationship to education so much after the Second World War, but she does write a history of women at Oxford. I can't remember when it comes out, it might be 1960, something like that, which suggests that she's still really interested in questions of female intelligence, although I'm not quite sure how far that falls into the kind of degradation of people that she regards as less intelligent as well. So I'm not completely sure on that, I'm sorry.
Okay, that's fine. More to research, more to find out.
Exactly.
Yes. Somebody come back to us once you've researched it. Yes. Right. Would anyone like to wave at me with a question or a comment? I will search you. Oh, everybody's very quiet today. Very good. Oh, right, Neil. Do unmute yourself. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, it's a question for Natasha. The American guy Wiggum, who made that assertion that 50% of the great minds come from 1% of the population. Did he have any sort of scientific basis for saying that, or did he just pull figures out of the air?
So hard to say, but I think he based his findings on intelligence tests, but they themselves were flawed and skewed. So I'm not sure how reliable his evidence basis was, but he did have an evidence basis for his argument.
Okay. Yeah.
But yeah, I was just really interested that she was citing this figure. But I think it goes to show how kind of widespread these views were in the interwar period and how kind of normalized they were to some degree.
Yeah.
But yeah, thank you for your question.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
Frank, you put your hand up there. Do you want to unmute yourself?
Yes, I'm listening to Vera Brittain's views on her schoolmates who aren't intellectual and aren't interested. Don't you think we can despise people who just aren't intellectual? They're interested in other things, and really, we can't all be intellectual, and we shouldn't say that that's the sole criteria for success for men or for women.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a really good point. And that's one of the reasons I was so interested in what Brittain was writing about, because I wanted to unpick this kind of relationship between ideas about people's worth and their intelligence, because, yeah, as you say, absolutely, we need to kind of not prize people's value based on their intelligence. But I think one of the interesting things about the way Brittain writes about ideas of merit and scholarship exams and competition in the interwar period is because this association between moral worth and intelligence is so kind of interwoven in her discussion.
Got a comment from Janet, who says, my girls' grammar school in the 60s certainly carried a desire to make us snobs, as did the mistress of Girton College in the 70s, who encouraged us all to become mothers in order to renew the intellectual qualities of the population. Do you want to say any more, Janet? Shall I unmute you? Go ahead.
Well, I think it takes a lot of undoing if that's the kind of schooling that you're offered as a working class girl. And in recent years, I think the point about the link between moral deficiency and intellectual deficiency is a really, really important one to remember, because I think that was very powerful also in the education system. So that those who were lower IQ scores were also thought, for example, to be vulnerable to sexual promiscuity, which would have been seen as some kind of moral degeneracy in some way. The other idea that I've come across recently is from a French philosopher of democracy called Jacques Rancière, who uses the idea of equality of intelligence as his basis for all his thinking about democracy. And I found that really powerful, precisely because I was trained in all this kind of thinking that I've written about in the note. So I think it's wonderful to hear you both unsettling that mid-century hegemonic thinking in the labour movement, because it's still certainly persisted towards the end of the 20th century, and may still do. I don't know. I don't really know how it's dealt with in schools now, but thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. And that Rancière text is really interesting. Is it The Ignorant Schoolmaster?
It is.
Yeah, it's a really interesting text. So, I mean, for other people, it's basically this idea that only the ignorant master can properly teach, because they're asking questions that they don't know the answer to, rather than leading the person they're teaching to a predefined set of answers that they're seeking to find, basically. But yeah, thank you for your comment. It's really interesting.
Do we have anybody else? I'm jumping between screens here. Everybody is so satisfied with what they've heard, or is busy ordering the Division Bell Mystery from the British Library online as we speak, possibly. And I can see there are some teachers around, so yeah, teachers, if you want to speak to us, please do. Gemma says, for Clara, do you have a sense of why Wilkinson's two novels were so different? Was it perhaps to do with the response to clash, e.g. the review you mentioned?
That's such an interesting question. I mean, they are very different, but I think both are marked by her, her sort of commitment to genre fiction. So we have a romance novel and then a thriller. Both were serialized in the Express, so both have a kind of a sort of a serial quality, or a familiarity with the kind of conventions of the serial. But I think that she, her writing represented a sort of, she writes about this in an article in the Star, a kind of an escape from what she described as the kind of, the sort of petty demands of her political career, or it's a kind of bittiness. So what I think attracted her to it was the ability, she talks about being able to produce a whole, right, or something that was entirely hers, that wasn't a matter of kind of consensus or argument or kind of discussion and collaboration. I think what she liked doing was just creating one sort of thing. And I mean, in some ways they're quite similar. I mean, both of them feature characters that are kind of quite closely modeled on her, and quite sort of beautiful young red-haired women who are extremely kind of desirable to all of the male characters, almost kind of, irresistibly so. So there's some kind of fantasy wish fulfillment that operates through both of those texts, which is quite interesting to draw out, which is the subject of another talk, but is something that I'm also interested in, which I think also kind of has an effect on her sense of herself as a Labour woman, and maybe questions or should sort of skew our sense of reading these as straightforward articulations of a sort of socialist feminism, right? There's more sort of going on with gender there. But thank you very much for your question.
Okay. We do pride ourselves on our questions. I say we, like I'm asking, but yeah, we have a very engaged audience, as you see. So yes, Gemma is now, she loved Clash, but this has now inspired her to read the Division Bell Mystery as well. Yeah, as I think. Yeah. Right, folks, I'm going to just check. You've got a final call to. Oh, somebody was just waving at me there. Hang on, who was that? Right, Pete. There you go. Do unmute yourself. Hang on.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Really well for Natasha. You mentioned Time and Tide, which of course was edited and in large part financed by Lady Rhondda. I just wonder if you looked into her at all, and how significant you see her in terms of shaping the sort of intellectual climate that you've been talking about?
Thanks, Pete. Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and Clara might have ideas as well. Yeah, definitely very influential, and particularly for Winifred Holtby as well, who was on the board of directors of Time and Tide at one point. Yeah, no, I think you're right. Yeah, influential in bringing together a kind of, I guess, a panel of women, but also not only women, because it started out advertising itself as a periodical for women, but then it moved into a broader audience and advertised itself as being for men and women. But yeah, I think Lady Rhondda kind of brought together a hub of engaged writers and thinkers, and the periodical published reviews, but also journalism and periodical and serialized fiction as well. So it was an important kind of cultural and political hub in many ways. But I don't know if Clara's got, she knows more about Time and Tide.
Not really, just to say that both Woolf and Wilkinson contributed to Time and Tide as well. So I think it's an important setting, but also unsettling our sense of high and low culture, or so it's one of these kind of sites where writers of all different kinds of fiction, sort of modernist or kind of purportedly middlebrow, were writing and were sort of work was circulating.
Okay, thank you very much. Thanks. This has been, Natasha and Clara were due to be part of a mini conference we were going to be having on Labour women. So this is our tribute to that mini conference, but that will happen, we hope. But yes, in the meantime, it's been really nice to be able to do a mini conference of hearing from both of you. So thank you very much indeed to everyone who's contributed, but particularly, of course, to Natasha and to Clara. And now next week, on Wednesday, the 9th of December, we're back for another double bill, which will finish our 2020 talk series. And Matthew Crowther is going to be speaking about C.J. Grant's The Political Drama, a series of political satires, of which we have a fantastic scrapbook of those cartoons. And he'll be followed by Sharif Daimish talking about his father, Hassan al-Sattor Daimish, a Libyan artist and satirist who spent most of his life in exile in the northwest of England. So a reminder that this talk has been recorded and will be uploaded to our YouTube channel shortly. That's youtube.com/WCM Library. And a further reminder that our talks are, as usual, free. However, if you feel able to support the library, there is a donate button on our website. Thanks again, and goodbye until the same time next week. Take care, in solidarity. Very best wishes from all at the Working Class Movement Library. Goodbye.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Lynette. Thanks,
Thank
Clara.
you. Bye, Natasha. Bye.